Hello, my name is Jasmine Drake, and I'll be presenting decision making and the role of cognitive biases in workplace safety incidents. To begin, a quick agenda. We'll start with the literature review, move on to the intervention, its goals and objectives, the target population, proposed methods and materials, implementation steps, the assessment and evaluation strategies, the expected outcomes of the intervention, a brief reflection, the conclusion, and a reference page. Starting off, we have the literature review. The first literature to review is Goldstein 2019, our class textbook. Goldstein proposes that we use indicative reasoning to quickly and easily make judgments based on observations. It is when those shortcuts lead to faulty conclusions by ignoring evidence or having our attitudes cloud our judgment that this becomes cognitive bias. Cognitive bias are most frequent when people fail to critically evaluate evidence. These failures have manifested in similar ways across all mankind, creating things such as my side bias, confirmation bias, availability bias, and groupthink, just to name a few. The next piece of literature will show how those cognitive biases have a real impact on everyday decisions, even if you don't notice it. Springer 2016 showed when decisions become more and more crucial, the consequences of cognitive biases' impact become more dire as well. Springer identified how leaders in the workplace are not usually aware of cognitive biases because they can reduce uncertainty, despite the fact that uncertainty is at the core of decision making. Some biases that affect decision making are anchoring, attribution error, in-group biases, and optimism biases. The effect these biases have on decision making is that leaders may be blind to how an intervention is not working, even when the evidence points to that conclusion. Workplace safety incidents occur even when there are rigid rules in place to prevent them. However, since evaluating the processes meant to prevent safety incidents is contingent on human judgment, there exist cognitive biases and there exists faulty judgment. After defining cognitive biases and the impacts of it, now we have a real-world example by Schaffner and Honda, 2018. In a prominent paper on the subject, they discussed the details of the Yarnell Hill fire. In this case, identified cognitive disengagement with safety-related mandates was the cause of the preventable incident. Like in Springer's paper, said cognitive disengagement arose from cognitive biases such as optimism bias and in-group bias. Both show that there's a deadly effect of cognitive biases, and it is also the biggest barrier to implementing safety-related interventions and increasing situational awareness. By discussing the disastrous decision-making that came about faulty judgments caused by cognitive biases, Schaffner and Honda sought to show that cognitive biases are a barrier and an invisible sabotaging element to any implemented intervention geared towards preventing workplace incidents. Further showcasing how cognitive biases can result in safety incidents is Murata et al. 2015, where heuristic-based biases and overconfidence biases resulted in distorted decision-making. Murata et al. Points out that potential interventions must identify where and under what circumstances these cognitive biases are most present in the organization. Imagine, for say, one develops an intervention that focuses on bringing awareness to cognitive biases and is aimed at the majority of workers in an organization. Such an intervention might be inherently flawed if it does not address the key decision makers in the organization, which are usually not part of the general population. Kinsley et al. 2019 showed us that we have agency in implementing effective safety policies. This idea comes from how cognitive biases can be identified before the implementation of workplace regulation or policies, even though specific behavior cannot entirely be predicted. This was shown in an investigative paper on fire evacuations, where it is identified that in crisis moments, people employ heuristics to reduce the time and cognitive load associated with effort for problem-solving tasks such as reacting to an emergency. By examining these unexpected responses, decision makers were able to implement them in interventions with the goal of preventing faulty judgment that would lead to unsafe behavior. Finally, in Murata 2017, it is shown the limitations of interventions. Here, cultural differences and cognitive biases are both important in preventing safety incidents. The key takeaway was that interventions to reduce incidents from cognitive biases must be feasible in the culture they exist in. For example, having a culture of learning about cognitive biases and learning from failure is a good intervention if and only if such a culture is feasible. This brings in the perspective of understanding a workplace culture before implementing any interventions. This is an important reminder to realize the limitations of an intervention's implementation and the fact that an implementation must be realistic to be effective. Moving on to the intervention. Let's begin with the goal. The goal of the intervention is to create a lasting and effective change that decreases decisions that lead to safety incidents via a cognitively mindful approach with emphasis on cognitive biases. There's 5 objectives: to gain a common understanding of the material, to link that same decision-making with safety incidents and real-world examples, to assess the culture and other current effectiveness of safety interventions, to discuss with stakeholders possible modifications or additions to existing interventions, and to test out proposed interventions on a small scale, and then execute it later down the line. The target population of this intervention would be an organization that deals with crises and dangerous decisions. This could be a factory, a military branch, or any of the public services such as firefighters. This is due to how in those careers there exist more actions and decisions that directly result in death or damage. Therefore, the extremely critical approach to decision-making and safety is more prevalent. When implementing this, I identified 4 methods and materials. We'll use naturalistic surveys, classroom sessions, after-action reviews, and anonymous surveys. Now moving on to the implementation steps. First, the decision makers in the organization must learn the cognitive principles and theories that guide combating cognitive bias. After establishing a common knowledge of the topic, the intervention would then shift to applying the learned principles to the organization looking to implement it. They must relate new knowledge to something already of value and identifying how this new knowledge might help in the future. This is because this increases one's willingness to engage and remember the material. Following, we must assess which cognitive biases are most influential in the organization. Also at this time, an anonymous service of the pre-existing interventions to prevent workplace safety incidents would occur. After gathering this data, the intervention would transition to creating and adjusting safety interventions. Creation of safety interventions would then be followed by small-scale implementation, which would be observed by the organization's stakeholders, and they would have an after-action review to try to increase the effectiveness of the safety intervention before moving to a large scale. The goal of the after-action review would be to analyze the intervention by discussing the cognitive biases it does or does not promote. The final steps would be as follows. When the stakeholders have seen the proposed implementation play out on a small scale and become secure in its effectiveness, the proposed implementation should take effect in the entire organization. All members should be given an opportunity to learn and to discuss the new intervention so that there is an even change across the organization. After a set amount, this intervention should be assessed and modified as needed. This intervention would be successful if there were less safety incidents, and polling shows that more than not, people in the organization are aware of their cognitive biases. This can be assessed via a survey or conducting statistical analysis on the rate of safety incidences in the organization. Some expected outcomes is that there will be a higher self-awareness of cognitive biases and a resulting decrease in incidents stemming from decisions made with cognitive biases. Cognitive principles show us that people are more likely to do or notice things at the front of their attention. Organizations must keep the values behind this intervention as priorities so that their workers will also keep it close in mind. Upon reflection, this was a difficult project to try to come up with a research question. I had to relate it to my own job in order to find something that linked decision-making and cognitive biases with real-world examples. After that, it became easier to see the connection between cognitive principles and actually implementing something helpful. I ended up leaning on my decision-making processes in order to try to identify where there be gaps in thinking cognitively instead of blindly following. Due to that, I was able to finish the project and connect it better to the material I learned in class. This is a reference page. Thank you very much for listening.